Thank you, and apologize to all those listening on the recording who are missing the first couple minutes. Okay, so the Rambam says, right, this seems like a very radical, strange idea that God would give us mitzvot only because of the way that humans were conditioned and used to living, with the purpose of weaning us off of those mitzvot. Right? Mitzvot should be eternal. So he says, to show that this is in fact correct, says when God led us out of Egypt, he could have taken us on a direct path to Eretz Yisrael, to the land of Israel, but he didn't. Why not? Beginning of Parshat B'Shalach, Vahi B'Shalach Barat Ha'am, V'lo nacham Elokim derech Eretz Plishtim, ki karovu, because it was too close. Ki amar Elohim, pen yirachem ha'am b'rotam milchama v'shav b'mitzrayim. God was concerned that they may become afraid when they encounter war so soon after having left being slaves, and they'll go back to Egypt. Right? Even in the circuitous route which God led us, we still had a desire to go back to Egypt. So he had to take us in a more roundabout way, presumably. So the Rambam says that we see that's an illustration of the same idea, that God gives us things in gradual steps that we should be able to handle. Then he comes to our passage that we're going to be concerned with tonight. It is contrary to man's nature that he should suddenly abandon all the different kinds of divine service. And am I reading the right place? Yeah. That he should suddenly abandon all the different kinds of divine service and the different customs in which he has been brought up, and which have been so general that they were considered as a matter of course. It would be just as if a person trained to work as a slave with mortar and bricks or similar things should interrupt his work, clean his hands, just lost my place.
And at once
fight with real giants. It was the result of God's wisdom that the Israelites were led about in the wilderness till they acquired courage. For it is a well-known fact that traveling in the wilderness and privation of bodily enjoyments, such as bathing, produce courage, whilst the reverse is the source of faint-heartedness. Besides, another generation rose during the wandering that had not been accustomed to degradation and slavery. So the Rambam says, what's the reason that we had to wander in the desert for 40 years?
To toughen people.
To toughen the people, right? That we were not ready to go into battle to conquer the land. We had to abandon our slave mentality, and we had to build up our own courage. What's the problem with this explanation?
It could have been done miraculously with
Okay, so certainly God could have performed miracles to easily vanquish the other nations from Israel and just give us the land. That's certainly a possibility.
Or it could be reprogramming.
Okay.
as people.
There's a more literal problem. There's a more textual difficulty.
Rambam seems to have a very unflattering view of human nature.
Okay.
He was a doctor after all.
Well, he was a doctor and a very elitist philosopher. So that's not a surprise knowing the Rambam. But the Torah told us why we had to wander the desert for 40 years.
Right, sure.
What's the reason we see in Sefer Bamidbar?
They were in the land for 40 days, so it had to be 40 years. You need that kind of an explanation.
Okay, well, even more basic. Who was in the land for 40 days?
Yeah.
The spies.
The spies.
Yeah, that should be
It was a punishment for listening to the bad spies, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
So what's the Rambam telling me? That it was about conditioning the human nature to be accustomed and gain courage. It was a punishment for the spies.
Sorry. Can you mute here?
Does anyone?
I'm going to try to mute. I'm sorry.
Does anyone have any ways to save the Rambam? How can we?
There's if I get it right, one of the divisions in the Israeli military is called Golani.
Yeah.
They're very tough.
Yeah.
And they're basic training is extremely demanding, and the final segment of it is to go wandering off into the desert, the deserted areas,
Right.
and to walk, run 40 kilometers or 50 kilometers, something that order, 30 miles overnight without stopping. Anyone who falls, anyone who faints, the remaining ones have to carry them. They're trained what to do, how to do it, and they do it. And everybody must arrive at the other end of the mission, which is the place where they will be effectively sworn in as real people.
Okay.
It's something which is
Like Navy SEAL training.
it's
Only you can't wash out.
but elite effort, and it's like what is done with the component elements of steel. They have to be broken down, melted, smelted, and then beaten with hammers to make them into something
Else.
much better.
Right, and the
much
Torah gives
stronger.
us a similar idea, right? The Torah says that, right, describes Egypt as Kor HaBarzel,
Yeah.
as the smeltering furnace in which the nation was hardened and conditioned for life, you know, whatever life might be. But still, how are we saving the Rambam? Right, the Rambam seems to be going against the pshat of the Torah.
There are layers of meaning, and so there's certain levels of being able to think, to understand, that regular people can grasp, that smarter people, better trained people, better raised people can grasp, and so on. And so there is a sort of organic process of growth, intellectual, spiritual growth that has to happen, and that takes time.
Right, so you're agreeing with the Rambam, but we still have the difficulty that the Torah gives us the reason, which seems to be not the reason of the Rambam.
Well, but except that they're not totally contradictory, because it's a different generation, but they still needed the 40 years to, become accustomed to being strong and being independent and.
Yeah, but it seems, right, if we remember to the sin of the spies, it seems that had the spies not given their report, or had the people not listened, that they would have gone straight into the land in year 1 or year 2.
Maybe by not listening, they would have demonstrated that they were in fact ready.
Oh, that's beautiful.
And this just shows, nope, they just weren't there yet.
So
Proof in the pudding.
Had they rejected the spy's report, that would have shown that they didn't need this character training. I like that answer. I like that.
But there's a problem with that. God knows what people think, feel, how they understand.
Yeah, right.
To the extent of being able to predict what's going to be.
It doesn't change anything, because it's
Interesting.
No preordination.
But they're allowed to make errors, and it's part of the unfolding process of development.
Right.
People might argue about the theory of evolution, but it applies to human beings. They evolve over time. Some people more successfully than others. Some evolution goes on. It had to happen. It was necessary. It was foreordained effectively that certain things occur.
Yeah, so most people, I've not seen a great answer to this question. I mean, most say that that the Rambam is not giving a primary explanation, but once the facts are on the ground, and there was an extra 40 years, so then we can give interpretation sort of added as a secondary reason. And had they not, fact is they did listen to the spies, and the spies did give the bad report. Had there not been the bad report, so maybe they would have gone through more intensive Golani boot camp in 1 year as opposed to 40 years, or something along those lines. But it is an interesting dilemma to think about when we look at this Rambam. It's a fairly well-known idea that he gives about, the well-known ideas in the context of idolatry and prayer and the development, but that he applies it to our parsha as well is quite interesting. All right, that was a little food for thought, but now I wanted to delve into some of what happens in our parsha. So at the beginning, we have Moshe's introduction, and he kind of just sets the setting and gives them a little snap overview of the history up to this point. Interesting to think about, as we're sitting in shul, going through the parsha, why he highlights the events that he does highlight and doesn't highlight the events that are excluded or not mentioned in the parsha. That's not for now. But it's very clear that the point of this introductory speech is to get to where God gives them the marching orders that they're going to go and conquer the land. So in the end of chapter 1, Vanisa Mechorev Vanelech Kol HaMidbar HaGadol VaNorah Hahu Asher Ra'item Derech Har HaMori Kasher Tzivah Hashem Elokeinu Otanu V'Navor Kadesh Barnea. We left Chorev and we came to where we came. V'Amar Lechem Ba'atem Ad Har HaMori Asher Hashem Elokeinu Noten Lanu. I told you that we have now come to the mountain of Amorites, which God is giving to us. Re'ei natan Hashem Elokecha lefanecha et haaretz alei reish kasher diber Hashem Elokei avotecha bach al tira v'altecha. See, we have now come to the land that God has promised us. Go and conquer it. Do not be fearful. Then they came and they said, well, if we're going to go conquer the land, we need to know what we're getting ourselves into. And they sent the spies. Okay, so that's point number 1. Point number 2, beginning of the second chapter. I'm in source number 3. In verse 2, Vayomer Hashem Elai, Le'mor Rabachem Sovet Harzeh, Penu Lachem Tzafona. You've spent enough time camping out here. Go and march northward. Go conquer the land. And so the first place that they come to when they go to conquer the land, and this is quite interesting, especially given the Rambam's introduction. The Rambam says that for 40 years they've been training and getting to a point where they will be mentally and physically ready to conquer the land, to go to war and conquer the land. So who's the first nation that they come to? What's the first experience that they have with this background? It's Am Tzav Le'mor, Atem Ovim B'Gvul Acheichem B'nei Esav Hayoshvim B'Seir, Yu Mikem V'Nishmartem Me'od. You're going to come to the boundary of the descendants of Esav, who live in Seir. They're going to be afraid of you. Al Titgaru Bam, Ki Lo Etin Lachem Me'artzam Ad Midrach Kaf Ragel. Sorry, I don't have the English displayed. Do not fear them, because I will not give their land to you, not even one little footstep of it, because it is an inheritance of Esav. And again, we saw some of this in Parshat Chukot in our shir. Ochel tishbu meitam b'kesef, achaltem v'gamayim tichlu meitam b'kesef shritim. You're going to have to pay for any food that you get from them and for any water that you get for them. Yashem Elokecha beirachecha b'chol ma'aseh yadecha, lechtech, okay, because you were blessed by God, and you're going to pass peacefully through the land of Esav. And then what's the next place that they go to? Vaneifen v'navor derech midbar Moab. We come to Moab. Vayomer Hashem Elai al tatar et Moab al titgar bam milchama. Do not go to war against Moab. Ki lo eitim lecha me'artzo Yerusha, ki livnei lo tzmatati et har Yerusha. Because this land also you will not inherit, but I've given this to the descendants of Lot. So the first 2 lands that they come to, after having been in intensive training for 40 years, they're given the directive, do not fight them. Do not go to war. And it's really interesting, and it's really counterintuitive. Right? You would have thought after 40 years, after whatever training they've been going through, that they would be biting at the chomp to go and And, this is a real phenomenon that we see with soldiers in military situations, that they want to see action. And God's first instruction is the first two lands that you encounter, we're not going to go to fight against them. We're not going to battle them. So what's the message there? Why?
Self-restraint.
Okay.
What in Hebrew might be called havlaga. That
Okay.
was the term that has a certain history in the more recent Zionist movement that ends up in 48. But before that there's a recognition, can't fight now.
Mm-hmm.
Not full force because it's too dangerous. It will cost too much. It's not the eighth ratzon. It's not the right moment.
Right.
And one of the signs of maturity is self-control. And these are different kinds of tests then to
Most
see
definitely. Most definitely.
what they can do.
I see a different message.
What's that?
I see that they are being told that in some cases you don't fight. You make peace, you come to an understanding, you work something out. And you can't always assume that, war is the only way to go.
No, and I think the message is different. Given the very first Rashi, God gives this land to this people and that land to that people,
Right.
and God is not giving us their land, so we don't go to war. God is giving us Canaan, and
Okay.
then we go to war. It doesn't have to do with what we feel like fighting.
Okay.
I see it in the context of the spies. It's offense against what happened there. There, they didn't want to go to fight. Then they decide, okay, tomorrow morning we're going to fight. And Moshe says, don't do this. God didn't tell me to tell you to fight.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a way of saying you fight when Hashem tells you to go and fight. And that's the only time you go to fight.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think we're all kind of on the theme that there's some message of self-restraint, of discipline that has to be that's being told, whether that's on just to be an effective military force, you can't wage every battle that's right in front of you. You have to pick your fights and be wise and be strategic, right? That there's a political and diplomatic reality that they're now encountering. And as Gary put it, maybe it's theological as well. That we need to recognize that God has a plan for other nations, not just for us, and that we need to respect that and therefore hold back when necessary. So then we come finally to the first battle, or the first possibility for battle that they're given. I'm going to pick up in verse. Let's start in verse 17. And that should be displayed on the English right over here. Right, Aver Hashem Elai Limor. Ataver Hayom et Gvul Moab et Ar. So you're now leaving Moab. You're coming to Ar. V'karafta mu b'nei Ammon al titzarun v'al tikarbam ki lo yitei me'eretz b'nei Ammon l'chayusha. So also you can't go to war against Ammon because that was given to Lot. Eretz Rifa'im techashev afi. Okay, verse. Okay, let's go to verse 24. Kumu se'u v'iru et nachal Arnon. So you're going to come to the land of Arnon, or you're going to cross the river of Arnon, and I will give in your hands Sichon, the king of Heshbon ha'Emori. Ve'et arzo hechel reish mitgarbo milchama. You will begin to inherit it, to conquer it, and you will wage war against him. Hayom hazeh achel teit pachtecha v'yiratcha pnei amim tachal kol hashamayim. On this day I will begin instilling fear of you among the other nations. They will hear of you and they will tremble before you. So what does Moshe do with this information God just gave him? I sent messengers from the desert to Sichon, the king of Heshbon, with words of peace. saying, Ebra ba'artzecha baderech elech, lo asor yamin usmo. Let me pass through your lands quietly. I'll stay on the main highway. I will not deviate right or left. Ochel ba'kesef tishbareni v'achalti umayim ba'kesef yitain li v'shatiti ra ke'ebra beragli. I will pay for whatever food I consume and for whatever water I drink. Just let me pass by. Kasher asu li b'nei Esav hayushvim b'seir v'mavim hayushvim ba'ad de'ar ad asher avor et hayarden el ha'aretz asher Hashem Elokeinu notin lanu. Just as the b'nei Esav did, just as the other nations that we previously encountered did. Vayomer Hashem elai re'ei hachiloti tet lefanecha Sichon ve'et artzo achel v'reshet et artzo. God says, see, I'm giving you the land of Sichon to conquer. Vayetze Sichon likratenu hu b'chalamo nechama yahatza. Sichon came out to meet us in war, and we went to war and we won. So how does Moshe deviate from the plot? Does he follow God's instructions?
Well, on the surface, no.
Why not?
God told him to conquer and to
God told him to conquer and wage war. And what does Moshe do?
and conquer and wage war. Moshe says, "Let me pass through. We don't want war.
We don't want war. We want to go peacefully, right? We want to treat you just as we did the Bnei Esav and Bnei Lot, right? So Gary, right? This is certainly not going with the theological explanation because there was no promise made to Bnei Sichon that they were going to have this land to live in. So what's going on? Why is Moshe sending this message of peace?
There is a promise that was just made that at this time God is going to be spreading among the peoples of the world, or in this area, fear and trembling before Am Yisrael. And so Moshe, having heard that, if they're afraid, if you offer them an easier way out, we'll just pass by.
Right.
We'll pay for whatever. If they agree to that, you've conquered them in a way which is it's bloodless. It's less costly in some ways. But it is Moshe, in effect, he's not hitting the rock. He's talking to these people first. Give them a chance, like people in a besieged city. Give them the opportunity to leave or surrender without having to be annihilated.
Interesting. So Robert's saying that maybe this was a military strategy, that kind of just flexing your muscles, right? Big troop buildup at the border, and that might calm or get the enemy to.
But it's Moshe not doing what it seems the people are being instructed to do. Right.
So
wasn't the land promised to Avraham Avinu?
Yeah. So we'll get into some more of these interesting details, but just one very interesting suggestion. I just brought it from the Dot Mikra, which is a contemporary commentary on Chumash on all of Tanakh that incorporates some academic perspectives as well. So they write, Uperush ve'eshlach. Moshe said, I sent messengers to Sichon. It says that we should really interpret it as Kfar shalachti malachim kodem sha'amar li Hashem hachel reish v'titkar bo milchama. I had already sent messengers. I thought that every encounter with every nation is going to follow the same script as we did with Moab and Ammon. So therefore, I had already sent messengers in anticipation of this is how it's going to be. And then God says you have to go to war against them. It was too late. I couldn't recall the messengers. I couldn't get the message back. But had he got the message from God earlier, he would not have sent these messengers, which is quite a creative read of the situation.
I like that one.
Yeah.
I wrote a
Oh, no.
dissertation on this problem, on the communication with messages and all of that. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's a great one. I like that one.
Yeah, so then Rashi quotes the Midrash Tanchuma. He says, "Afal pi shelo tzivani hamakom likro l'sichon l'shalom, l'madati mimidbar Sinai." Even though God did not tell me to extend an offering of peace to Sichon, I learned that this is the proper thing to do from our experience in the Sinai desert. Mina Torah shekadma la'olam. Where in Sinai did he learn it? From the Torah itself. Kishabaka Baruch Hu litzna Yisrael, chazar ota al Esav Yishmael. Gali lefanav shelo yikabluha, afal pichein patach lahem b'shalom. Like the famous midrash that we quote often on Shavuot and other times during the year, that the nations of the world come to God and they say it's not fair. You favor the Jewish people because you gave them the Torah, but you never gave us a chance to follow the Torah. You never gave us an opportunity. So God says, okay, take the Torah. Here's your opportunity. You say, well, what's written in it? Don't murder. Well, we can't not murder. That's what our very nation is defined by, right? No gilui arayot, no illicit sexual relations. Well, our entire nation was founded on the incest of our father with his daughter, right? So they rejected Torah. And it was just a formality, right? That God said, okay, now I've given you the opportunity. I know you're not going to accept it, but let's go through the motions. So Rashi says here too, Moshe was going through the motions. He knew that Sichon would not accept the peace offering. He knew they were going to go to war. But part of the steps of going to war is you have to send a symbolic or formal offering of peace before raising arms and going out to battle. So it was a formality that Moshe went through, but he knew it would not be accepted, and therefore he just did it because that was the proper thing to do.
Rabbi Kaplowitz.
Yes.
On a separate matter, was God still providing the mun?
At this point, we believe yes. It's not clear exactly when the man stopped, but at this point, most
Because they're not
likely.
in the land yet.
Right.
So why did they even have to buy food from?
Yeah, so that's a good question. It could be for their animals. It could be as if it really was a sincere peace offering, so they wanted to give some economic incentive for them to accept it. There's different ways that people work out to explain that. Okay, let's move on with the Chizkuni, and we're going to do just the second comment of the Chizkuni where it says bet, number 2 in the English, Divrei Shalom, with words of peace. Lefi sherov eretz Sichon hayta me eretz Moab ve'Amon, v'lo me eretz Canaan, kar'u lo l'shalom. He says the majority, Gary, back to your point of Rashi at the beginning of the Chumash, which tells us that from creation, God had designated certain lands for certain nations. So the majority of this land, of Sichon, majority of it is outside the borders of Israel, which God had promised to Bnei Israel. So since the majority of it was not part of Eretz Canaan, Harulo l'shalom, Moshe was able to extend an offering of peace because it was not in the land that had been destined and designated for Bnei Israel. Aval og she'artzo hayta me'eretz Rephaim shehaya me'eretz Canaan lo karu l'shalom. But when it came later on to Og melech HaBashan, his land was already in Canaan proper, and therefore there was no peace offering because that was land that had been promised and designated and destined for Bnei Israel from the very beginning. She'ein korin l'shalom al eretz shiva umot k'moshe mefurash beparshat Shoftim. Because when it comes to the 7 nations of Canaan, we're not allowed to offer peace. As we see further on in Sefer Devarim and Parshat Shoftim. So let's go to Parshat Shoftim and see what the Torah tells us there. I'll leave the English displayed on your screen. When you come to a city to wage war, you first have to extend peace. And if they accept your offering of peace, then you have to accept it, and the entire people living there will be for your servants. If they don't listen to you and go to war, then you can wage battle against them. God will give them in your hands, and you will smite all of the males. But you must spare the women, the children, the animals, and the spoils of war, and you can take and eat of whatever bounty is left. That's what you do for all the cities and all the nations, not in the immediate vicinity of Eretz Canaan. Rak, but when it comes to the land and the cities of Canaan, which God has promised you, you cannot spare anybody. You must totally destroy the seven nations. In order that they not teach you to do all of the bad that they do and all the abominations that they do to their gods, and you will sin and you will have sinned to God. So there's a strong distinction between the battle that we wage against the seven nations of Canaan and the battle that we wage against other nations. What are the differences?
There's no total annihilation of the conquered population of a given city.
Okay, so the halachic distinction is Milchemet Mitzvah and Milchemet Reshut. When it comes to Milchemet Mitzvah, a war that we're commanded to wage, i.e. to conquer the land of Canaan, the seven nations, so then there's total annihilation. Then we have to totally destroy everyone, man, woman, and child. We can't keep any of the spoils. But when it comes to Milchemet Reshut, a discretionary war, then we're allowed to take spoils where we can only kill the men or the other soldiers. We spare the women, the children, the animals. Any other differences?
The reason for killing all of the several nations of the Canaanim, that there's a chance that they may infect Bnei Yisrael with the idolatry, human sacrifice, other things of their culture, in effect, like a virus that must be, or bacillus that must be eliminated. This gets to be kind of really problematic, because what it amounts to is there's a command for genocide. When the word was originally coined in 1943 by Raphael Lemkin, a Polish Jewish lawyer who was in New York at the time, he defined it as being an attempt to destroy a significant part of a people, if not all of the people, and like 10%, to decimate, in effect, and to totally annihilate. There's a problem.
Yeah, so we spoke about this ethical problem in the context of the mitzvah to annihilate Amalek, and various attempts that are made to explain. And maybe we can it's been a couple of years. We can revisit and relearn some of those sources, because it's important to confront those difficult texts and those difficult ideas. So there are various attempts to kind of legislate away the command for genocide, or the seeming command for genocide. Either, most famously with Amalek, and some extended to the other nations living in Canaan, by saying it's really a spiritual battle, and if the people do not show this, the spiritual and moral characteristics that define Amalek, then they're not part of Amalek. Or saying, in a technical sense, it's no longer a valid halacha because Sancherev mixed up all the nations. We don't know anyone's true lineage anymore, so we can't say for certain that someone is from Amalek. Or, as we're going to touch on, there are some who say that perhaps the way that we get out of this seeming difficulty is in the machlokas we're about to discover between Rashi and Ramban, and many others who weigh in on both sides of the argument as well. So when it came to the introduction of this passage we just read, it says, Ki tikrav el ir lehilachem aleha v'karata eleha lishalom. When you come to fight against the city, you must first offer peace. And that was at the beginning of this passage, which seemed to be talking about Milchemet Reshut. So Rashi writes, source number 10, make sure we can see the English. Ki tikrav el ir, when you come to a city and you offer peace, b'milchamat hareshut hakatuv medaber. This applies only for Milchemet Reshut, only for discretionary war, only for a war not against the seven nations, is when we have a commandment to offer peace before waging battle. But, Rashi would say, we have to fill in the blanks, when it comes to Milchemet Mitzvah, when it comes to the war to conquer the land of Israel, the war against the seven nations, we are not commanded to offer peace first. That's Rashi's position. It seems to be a pretty solid reading of the Torah. The Ramban comes along and he first quotes Rashi. Let me know if the English, if I need to scroll down more. Okay, he quotes Rashi. Rashi's position that the extension, the offering of peace is only in the context of Milchemet Reshut, of a discretionary war. So it says Rashi is based on the Sifrei, the Midrash Halacha, which says explicitly that this extending of peace is only in the context of Milchemet Reshut, of discretionary war. Right, and so he says Rashi is misreading the Sifrei. So the correct reading of the Sifrei is to simply say that there are two types of war. There's Milchemet Reshut, there's discretionary war, and there's Milchemet Mitzvah, there's obligatory war. Aval, Kriyat HaShalom, afilu b'Milchemet Mitzvahi. The extending of peace applies even in Milchemet Mitzvah, even in an obligatory war against the seven nations. Shechayavim likro l'shalom, afilu l'shiva amami. We're obligated to offer peace even to the seven nations, says the Ramban. Moshe kara l'shalom l'sichon melech ha'emori. Lo haya over al aseh v'lo ta'aseh shebeparsha ki acharim tachrimei. Moshe, and how do we know that that's the case? Because Moshe offered peace to Sichon. There's no way that Moshe would have violated both the positive and the negative commandments associated with Milchemet Mitzvah and going against the protocols set up.
So if they do surrender, Chivi, Yevusi, whatever, they say, we surrender.
Mm-hmm.
Are they to be left alive?
Yeah, so let's continue with the Ramban. Aval hefei shebenehem, kasher lo tashlim, v'asta milchama, shetzivaka ketuv berchokot, v'hakot ekol zechura, v'chayot lehem anashim v'ataf, v'zcharim, he says the difference between these two types of wars is if they do not, in both situations, if the peace offering is not accepted and we do wage battle against them, then in Milchemet Reshut, in discretionary war, we're only allowed to fight and to kill the males. We must let the women and the children live. And when it comes to the seven nations, we have to destroy the women and the children as well. But
even after they surrendered?
No,
or
if they refuse. But if they accept the peace offering, then we make peace.
Where is the text that says, after saying that none of them are to be left alive, not them, not their wives, not their children, not their cattle, not nothing.
The Ramban reads it as saying, when you go to war, right, and this applies both to Milchemet Mitzvah and Milchemet Reshut, when you go to war, you must first offer peace. Okay, and it doesn't have to spell out if they offer peace, if they accept the peace offering, then you let them be. That's obvious. The Torah doesn't have to say the obvious to us. And then the Torah gives us the details. If they refuse, and it's Milchemet Reshut, and it's a far off war, not for the land of Israel, then you only kill the men. And if they refuse and it's Milchemet Mitzvah, then you destroy everyone. That's how he reads the passage.
When it says far, it's a distant place. They're far away. I would suggest that might be meant figuratively. They are far away. They are distant in their values, in what they do, so that such people are so dangerous. And for Bnei Yisrael, who after 40 years in the desert and so on, they have been changed and so on. But
it's a nice read, Robert, but it's textually incorrect, right? It's the far away ones that have more leniency.
Getting late.
Yeah.
The possibility of conversion. It shows that if these people say, gosh, these people first offered us peace.
Mm-hmm.
Other people don't do that so much.
So that's
there's something special about them. Maybe
we're raising a very interesting question, Anne. Right? We know that classically we don't encourage conversion. Right? We're supposed to, in fact, discourage conversion.
Yep.
But it seems that this might be, there might be an underlying theme in the Torah that is pro-conversion. And I want, it's very possible that that's what's going on. If that were the case, we might have expected that we would want to try to convert those that are closer to us. It's a double-edged sword. Like, we understand that there's the possibility of corruption is greater if they're living among us, but it would also make more sense to convert those that are closer than those that are further away, if in fact that is what the Torah is getting at. But it does raise a very interesting question. I just want to conclude with a really interesting midrash, a really, I think, powerful midrash that can be applied in many different contexts. And this is from Tanchuma. There's different versions of this midrash and other sources as well. I'm in source number 12. So the midrash is commenting, this is in Parshat Chukat, the first time we encounter the offer of peace. Vayishlach Yisrael malachim al Sichon, zeh shehu omer, sur me'rav aseh tov, v'kei shalom v'radfehu. So this is connected to the verse from Tehillim, which says, sur me'rav aseh tov, distance from bad and do good, v'kei shalom v'radfehu, seek out peace and pursue it. Lo pikta ha'Torah lirdof achar hamitzvot. So in general, the Torah doesn't tell us, this is a really interesting philosophical idea, but in general, the Torah doesn't tell us to chase after the mitzvot. We don't have to actively pursue the mitzvot. Ella, rather, what do? Ki yikra kansipor. If you happen upon a bird's nest, then you have to shoo away the mother before taking the egg. You don't have to nowadays I've seen signs publicizing, if you want to do the mitzvah of Shiluach HaKan, call this number. And people are actually setting up the opportunity for it.
Yeah.
Right? Ki tifgash shor oivecha, right? If you encounter your enemy's ox, then you have to help him out. Right? The ox hasn't done anything bad to you. You have to help the ox if it's suffering under its load. You don't have to actively go looking for oxen that are struggling under the load. If you happen upon it, then you have to do this. If you see your enemy's ox, same thing. Right? When you harvest your olives, you have to leave some for the poor. Same with your vineyard. When you come to your friend's vineyard, are you allowed to take grapes? You're not allowed to take grapes. If it happens that you have the opportunity to do it, then do it. But you don't have to actively pursue and chase the opportunity to do these mitzvot. Right? It raises lots of interesting questions. Right? Do you have to, how far do you have to go out of your way to daven with a minyan? Right? How, all sorts of questions that that we've all encountered at different points in our lives. How much do we have to pursue the mitzvot, and how much can we, if we have happened upon it, if life leads us to the opportunity, then we take it. But when it comes to peace, hashalom, bakesh bimkomcha or dafeyu b'makom acher. When it comes to peace, you have to seek it out in our place and pursue it in a different place. Right? We have to actively pursue peace.
Go, Dave.
V'chein asu Yisrael af al pi shamar lanu HaKadosh Baruch Hu achel reish v'tidkar bo milchama v'adfu achar shalom. This is what Moshe and Bnei Yisrael did. Even though God told them, go wage battle against Sichon, they first extended peace. So as a value, the Midrash is telling us that peace is unique. And even
No,
with,
not quite.
Right, but
Tzedek,
it's,
tzedek, tirdofu.
what was that?
What?
Okay,
Tirdof, yes.
okay,
Tzedek
beautiful.
also.
So there are other mitzvot where we're told, right, or one other mitzvah we're told to pursue it. Right, tzedek, tirdof, justice, we should also pursue. So that's beautiful. It's not just peace, but there are other values that go beyond the normal requirements. So that's a beautiful extension of it. What the Midrash is telling us is that when it comes to peace, we have to be proactive and act and pursue it and go beyond what would have otherwise be required. Because that's what Moshe was doing when he extended peace. Right? The textual difficulties aside, that peace as the ultimate value, in this Midrash at least, is seen in a very positive light. And so we can use this, both in our context of our parsha, to explain why is it that Moshe did what he did, either because we take the Ramban's reading of Milchemet mitzvah also has requirement of peace offering, unlike Rashi, or that perhaps Moshe was playing in the political reality, going through the mechanics of war. You have to always begin with a formal peace offering, even if you know it wouldn't be accepted, even if you had no intention of really following through on it. But that there are certain core values that we have to go above and beyond in order to hopefully achieve and bring into life. And the Midrash also raising the question of what other mitzvot do we have to actively pursue and go out of our way to fulfill, is quite interesting. It raises many questions. So, are there any final questions or thoughts on this topic?
well, the final thought I have is, we had to dig pretty deep to get to that core value, that peace on its own, not just as a strategy, in the context of war.
Yeah.
And yet it's troublesome. So why didn't that come directly from God? This is your core value.
Yeah, that's a good question, right? So we could say it really was the core value, and that's why Moshe did it, even with the difficulties and even with the questions it raises. That Moshe recognized this was the core value. Right? It could lead us, and this could get me in trouble if there, depending on who listens to the recording. I don't know if anyone here will get me in trouble for this. But it does lead to possible questions of what do we do when core values are in conflict with halacha, right? And so I think the most often quoted example of that is the question of if there is a non-Jewish person who's sick in need on Shabbos, are we allowed to offer help to them or not? Which is halachically quite a complicated question. And we like to think it shouldn't be complicated. If there's a human in need that we're able to help, then we should just help them and ask the questions later. But some commentators say, even if it's halakhically incorrect, you got to do what's right in the moment on a human level. There's lots and lots of discussion in the halakhic literature about that question. Lots of ways that you get to the right answer. The question of how you get to the right answer is what makes it interesting and complicated. But it could be that this is another example of that. Is right. We could make this an example in a shir of values in conflict with halacha. And that you're right. Maybe the halacha is saying that Moshe was incorrect, but that the values that we aspire to might sometimes trump that, or might be in equal conversation and dialogue with it. And so we need to dig a little deeper to find the justification. It's an excellent question. It's an excellent question. All right, I think we'll end on that note. So the Tisha B'Av schedule was sent out in last Friday's email. It will be sent out with the announcements. It will be sent out as an independent email. Marav and Eicha begin 9:30 Motzei Shabbos. We'll have explanatory keynote on Sunday morning, and a couple of what look to be really excellent films that Robert has suggested in discussions in the afternoon prior to Mincha. Next Monday night is the baseball game. Everyone, all the Baltimore people on this year will be at the game. I'm looking forward to being in person for something a little bit more lighthearted with everyone. And then Tuesday night we'll get back together for Parshat Ve'chanan. Have a good night.
Thank
Night.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Shabbos, everyone.
Tuesday.
That's
Be
true.
fast.
There we